Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Homer, this is an exact replica of your workstation. Now we're going to simulate a power surge in core sector 8.
What the hell are you talking about? What do I do? What do I do? In the name of God, you've got to tell me!
Relax, it's just a simulator. Nothing can go wrong.
Just poke blindly at the controls until they let you go.
No, this can't be happening!
For the love of God, sir, there are 2 seats.
I like to put my feet up.
We're still not sure how he caused the meltdown. There wasn't any nuclear material in the truck.
Oh, very well. It's time for your bride.
Welcome to the Silky Smooth Sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in San Francisco, California today. And as always, I'm joined by
Bob Bazanko in Niles, Ohio.
And today we are rejoined by a guest, a longtime friend and guest. Before we get into the introduction, there's been a bit of a conversation going on in the mainstream some, but also in left media that we're going to talk about today, which is around nuclear energy, nuclear power, nuclear weapons, the history of it. The Green and Red podcast is very decidedly anti-nuke or no nukes. And we're more than a little bothered about the sort of pro-nuke position that we're hearing from other people who call themselves, leftists and socialists and things like that. So joining us today to talk about all of this and his book, Atomic Days, is Joshua Frank. Welcome back to Green and Red, Josh.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Yep. Josh is the managing editor of CounterPunch, and he is the author of Atomic Days, the Untold Story of the Most Toxic Place in America. And maybe we could actually talk a little bit about that. The book talks a lot about it was a nuclear weapons production facility in Eastern Washington and Hanford, Washington. And just to kind of play off the title, Josh, why is it an untold story?
The book has a lot of information in there that I don't think is publicly available or wasn't until we published the book. But more so, it's really just a story of kind of the people's story of Hanford and of the weapons production site that maybe some of your listeners don't know about. Hanford was one of the 3 locations chosen during the Manhattan Project. And their job was to produce plutonium. The first commercial plutonium reactor was built in Hanford, the B reactor. The site produced plutonium for the first bomb that was the bomb that was dropped in Nagasaki. And over the course of about 4 decades, it produced the majority of the plutonium that ended up in the atomic arsenal of the United States. And that was mostly during the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, it became a cleanup site almost overnight in the late 80s. So a little bit about Hanford's in Eastern Washington. It's located along the Columbia River. It was chosen as a kind of a location because it was remote. It was sort of out of sight, out of mind. The indigenous communities that were there and also some of the more poor farm communities were easily removed. And it's a very expansive area. It's almost 600 square miles, and it's beautiful, beautiful terrain, but it's terrain that will never, in our lifetimes, unfortunately, be publicly accessible because it's so toxic. So when it was producing plutonium over that course of its lifetime, it also produced a ton of waste, chemical waste, and obviously high-level radioactive waste. That much of that waste, the high level radioactive waste in particular, is still out there. It's sitting in these huge hulking underground tanks, 177 of them. 149 of those tanks are single shelled tanks, and they will hold 56 million gallons of radioactive sludge. The problem, of course, is what to do with this stuff. As we'll talk about with nuclear energy, it's kind of the same problem with plutonium and other byproducts of the process of fission. But in the case of Hanford, we're dealing with the aftermath of the US war machine. I mean, I like to say that the Cold War, in many ways, it's still bubbling out there. And these tanks, just to kind of talk about how perilous it is, the tanks really were only supposed to last a couple of decades. I mean, we're going on a long time now. They were built in the, a lot of them were built in the 50s and 60s. We're really only supposed to last until the early 80s at most, and which I talk about a lot in the book. I mean, even early on, engineers were talking about that this is really a temporary solution for this problem that they did not have a long-term answer for. And of course, they don't have a long-term answer to store nuclear waste anywhere, but especially then. But of course, the quest to prop up the US war machine and our atomic arsenal took precedent and was far more important than worrying about the aftermath. And so that waste out there is really in a bad situation. 2 of the tanks right now are leaking. They're leaking into the groundwater supplies underneath them. These tanks are 6-7 miles from the Columbia River. So that groundwater will eventually reach the Columbia River, and in many cases it already has. There were documented at least 67 leaks over the course of Hanford's lifetime. And then we had intentional releases of radiation. We've had other accidents. I mean, it's a horrible, horrible situation. And it is now the costliest environmental cleanup in world history. The price tag's at $677 billion right now. To put that in perspective, it was like 450 billion just a few years ago. So my guess is by the end of the decade, it'll be over $1 trillion. And not really any major work has been done. None of that high level radioactive waste has been vitrified, which is what they're planning on doing. And vitrification is really just like taking the stuff out of these tanks and turning it into glass so that it can be stored safely, or safely as it can be. So it's a really, really bad situation. And those 2 tanks that are leaking right now, the Department of Energy, which oversees the project, doesn't have an answer for, because there isn't really good answers for this stuff, which is a huge, huge problem. So the book really gets into all of this. It gets into the whistleblowers that are calling out the contractors and calling out the Department of Energy, and also talking about the worst case scenarios. The leaking tanks are obviously a huge immediate problem, but they're also, some of these tanks are producing hydrogen, and they have to be continually off-gassed, because if there's a hydrogen buildup in one of these tanks and somehow there's a spark that ignites it, or electricity goes down, or something malfunctions, there's a number of scenarios. There could be an attack of some sort, a number of scenarios that could lead to literally an atomic explosion. I mean, you have a hydrogen buildup in one of these tanks that explodes, and that radioactive material could spread far and wide. And not a lot of people know about this place, even though we're paying for it. A lot of people in the Northwest don't really know what's going on there. So yeah, my hope is that that story that hasn't really been told much, makes its way out with this book.
I was looking to see if Bob had a question. My quick question is: are there any, the efforts to clean it up are mostly actually being outsourced, correct?
Right.
Like there's a lot of like Bechtel and other companies like that, and I'm going to assume that that's part of the exorbitant cost is
yeah, absolutely. I mean, Bechtel really came up with this idea that's now really central to all of the defense contracts and Department of Energy contracts, called cost plus contracts. And essentially what that is it's like an open checkbook that the government has, or that they have with the government. You can kind of think about it if you're remodeling your kitchen and the contractor gives you an estimate for $15,000, but it ends up being $25,000. Well, multiply that by billions, and that's essentially what has happened out at Hanford. The original estimates were, pretty reasonable compared to what they are now. And they really are getting paid to not get the job done in many cases. And one whistleblower, Walter Tamasitis, who ended up being fired and sued and won. And I wrote about his case about 10 years ago for Seattle Weekly. And he's a central whistleblower, calling, Bechtel out and also the Department of Energy out for being complicit in this. And even more so, on the technical side, just to talk about kind of what the contractors kind of run the show out there, the Department of Energy is just really understaffed. They don't have the technical expertise to oversee every aspect of the cleanup, because the Department of Energy is underfunded. So the money is being shelled out to the contractors, but not to the Department of Energy. And the Department of Energy, much like the EPA and other agencies, especially under the Trump administration, were defunded, just making matters even worse.
And they put Rick Perry in charge of it, which actually says a whole lot.
Yeah, exactly. One, scientist that I interviewed who goes on record, Donald Alexander, who also I would consider a major whistleblower, at least from the Department of Energy side of things, talks about this. He talks about that his staff, he's now retired, but his staff was really, just didn't have enough people to oversee all these aspects of the project. So a lot of times problems that, arise could have been solved sooner, but they just didn't have the mechanisms in place to catch it. And it's a problem that's like permeates the cleanup out there. And I think it's important also to I get this question a lot too. What does a cleanup look like? I mean, there are, aside from all that radioactive waste in those tanks, there's hundreds of billions of gallons of chemical waste that was literally dumped into the soil out there during its process when it was making plutonium. So how do we remediate that? What does that look like? And I don't think it'll ever be cleaned up in the sense that it's ever going to be what it once was, unfortunately. But cleanup to me means getting this to a place where we aren't on the verge of a major radioactive accident. And right now, we are on the brink of that. And every day that goes by, it becomes greater.
Just thinking about the Columbia River, Portland is downstream from the Columbia River. And so, if this stuff leaks into the Columbia River, then it's a major metropolitan area that's facing radioactive.
Yeah, and aside from that, I mean, the Columbia River, there's commercial fisheries, on the Columbia River. There are the irrigation of the Columbia feeds tens of thousands of Northwest farmers. A major accident out there, aside from the slow leaking process that will build up over time. If we did have a major accident out there, the economy of the Northwest would just crumble. And if this stuff were to go airborne, there's all bets are off. I mean, I think it would spread all the way to the East Coast, of course, just like when we have the big fires in the Northwest, where there was smoke that covered, Washington, D.C. The radioactive particles would spread far and wide. I think cities like Boise, Idaho, that are closer might become unlivable. The radioactive fallout could be so great, people don't want to live there. I mean, it could be really devastating. And of course, if there was an economic collapse in the Northwest, that would, trigger, I think, a global economic crisis. And that's just the economic side, right? I mean, the environmental side and the toll on the environment and humans would be even greater. So yeah, it's a really scary situation, I think.
Well, for a while now, especially since 3 Mile Island, I think just the general public has been really concerned about nuclear power as well as nuclear weapons. A big resistance to it, like no nukes. But now it's making a comeback, even on the left, or maybe especially on the left. And I just wonder why you think these folks, Jacobin and certain podcasts and things like that have kind of gone all in. Mm-hmm. And I think they're portraying it as this kind of pro-worker, anti-fossil fuel thing. But, I was raised in an era where no nukes was kind of a core value.
Yeah. I like to think of, before I really get into my sort of anger towards some of their positions. I do think that a lot of the younger generation on the left that haven't been around long and don't know a lot about the anti-nuke movement, they don't really understand the success of the anti-nuke movement of essentially putting the brakes on the proposals for hundreds of plants, don't really understand Chernobyl, don't understand Fukushima, but are really, really frightened about climate change, rightfully so. And so when the boosters of atomic energy come along and say, oh, here's an easy fix. I mean, this is a technology we've had forever, and you believe the propaganda, right? Which is that it's safe, it's reliable, it doesn't produce CO2 emissions. All of these things are very attractive, I think, to some people that don't hear the other side of it and the reality of atomic energy. So I think I'd like to give some of them at least the benefit of the doubt that they haven't been well informed. But again, those people that are spewing the propaganda are the ones that need to be challenged, and we all know who they are. And they are essentially mimicking the talking points that we've been hearing for decades. And they're well funded, and now using climate change as the scapegoat for pushing for this. I think we're gonna, this is our future. I mean, I think we're gonna have to continue fighting this propaganda that's coming out of the pro-nuke left. And I think it's very real. I think it's really dangerous. And I think that unfortunately, fortunately and unfortunately, if we see an accident like at Zaporizhia, I mean, obviously now in Ukraine, we're learning that these nuke plants are tools of war and are forever going to be used as tools of war. Putin set a very dangerous precedent there. That if there was an accident, an attack, if the backup generators fail, if a number of things could happen, these conversations could change tomorrow. I mean, if you even believe all the rhetoric that we have an answer for the waste, that uranium mining's benign, that they're totally safe and reliable, no one, not even the biggest proponents of atomic energy are going to tell you that these things are safe in a war zone. So I mean, there's just so many reasons to oppose this stuff.
But I have seen some of the propagandists actually saying that they are safe in a war zone. That it would just
I've
momentarily
seen that too, yeah.
talk.
The worst could happen is that it can go offline. I think the really genuinely ignorant Lee Phillips said that at one point to me, that the worst that could happen at Zaporizhia was that the power could go offline. Yeah, I think there's a lot more that could happen.
Just one real quick question about back to Hanford real quick, that just to then to kind of move on to something else, is with the whistleblowers, and then it also seems like some indigenous activists have also been part of this sort of resistance to lack of action, I guess you could say, on cleanup or whatever. Has there been any, we know about like Obama's war on whistleblowers, and to be a whistleblower is a lot more of a dangerous approach to take than maybe it used to be. Maybe it was always like that. But has there been any retaliation against some of the whistleblowers around Hanford?
Oh yeah, big time. There's been, when I was writing for Seattle Weekly and covering Hanford, there was a string of whistleblowers that each really faced different types of persecution. Some of them, in the case of Walter Tamasitis, they silenced him by removing him from his post and then literally putting him in like a basement off-site. And then he became sort of an in-house consultant that he would travel around the different sites. He worked for a contractor under Bechtel, a subcontract Bechtel, URS, and really just ruined his life, ruined his career. And he was just one example. Donna Bushy, others were similarly silenced and reprimanded for speaking out. The DOE has gone after Bechtel for some of these things. They've paid fines, they've lost lawsuits, and many times they do these payouts, they never have to admit guilt. But the culture out there, I believe, is very much the same. It's still very secretive. And there's just so much profit at stake. So these whistleblowers are a threat to that profit margin. And sometimes getting the job done and meeting the deadlines on time is a disincentive because they don't reach their benchmarks and get those extra payouts sometimes. So the way these contracts are structured, I think, lend to an environment that is harsh towards whistleblowers. And that's just like sort of at the contractor level. The bigger level is, I think, because the site operated as like a covert military site for so long, that sort of secrecy around the whole cleanup still exists. And the government is really good at keeping keeping people in line. And they're constantly, and as the contractors constantly are moving around managers, and it's really hard to get a grasp of, what's going on out there. And that's on purpose, I think. So when you have some of these guys that are old time, engineers and scientists speaking out, we have to listen to them. And they're not always, they're not always on, they're not progressives, these are mostly like conservative Republicans that are worried about taxpayer dollars and some of the things that we can agree on, and they're also very worried about the safety at Hanford as well, and the risks that it poses. So that's the job of journalists, right, and others to try to get their stories out to the world, because they certainly are, the DOE and their contractors don't make it easy to do.
Did you have another Hanford question, Scott? Or?
No, good.
I was just gonna, kind of moving into this current resurgence in these, kind of pro-nuclear arguments. It seems like what a lot of these people are saying is it's cleaner, it's safer, it's less expensive, and I just wondered if you wanted to kind of give a brief description of what they're saying, and then we can kind of get into the larger issue of talking about what the reality is.
Sure. Maybe I'll put myself in their shoes for a second. Well, I think they really are, they focus on the CO2, right? And I think that they really downplay the risks that the waste poses as well. So what they'll say is, look, we can, it's going to take, tens of thousands of square miles of open space to put in solar panels. We could put a small plant, they call them SMRs now, small modular reactors, all over the place, and power everything endlessly. Wind power, solar power, that is really great when the wind's blowing and the sun's shining, but what about at night? We need to have something that's continuous. And so we need something that complements other renewable energies, and nuclear is perfect for that. It's also really, really safe. The accidents that have happened are really overblown. Chernobyl really didn't kill as many people as they say. Fukushima was, avoidable, not that big of a deal. 3 Mile Island didn't hurt anybody, so the accidents themselves are completely overrated, and it's a lot of fear mongering going on. The uranium mining, well, yeah, it was really dirty and bad in the past and had some problems, but we can do it in a much, better fashion. And, mining for minerals that go into solar panels and, wind turbines and everything else is also very impactful. Lithium mining has horrible effects. So we can't ignore, can't just, rag on uranium mining. We should look at this whole picture here. So I think
uranium mining's jobs. Lots of jobs.
Yeah, that's right. It's jobs.
Jobs
and
for
so
the
are, and so are
people.
plants. These are good, well-paying jobs, right? So yeah, I think those are a lot of the things that I hear consistently. And of course, it's a carbon neutral energy source. There's nothing better than that, right? So that's the rhetoric that I hear a lot, which of course can be debunked pretty easily. From the uranium mining is horrible, right? And I guess first to say that those of us that oppose nuclear energy don't also see some of the negative impacts of renewables is ridiculous, right? I mean, of course we know that lithium mining can be horrendous, and we know all of these things, and we probably are hopefully promoting degrowth and not just switching to other sources of energy. And we understand the underpinnings of capitalism and how that plays into all of this, and of consumption, right? So to just think that like, oh, these people, just because you, well, and some of them are even more disingenuous. Some of them will say, oh, you oppose atomic energy, that must mean you want coal energy everywhere, you know, that kind of thing. And they'll even go so far as to say that the anti-nuke movement was responsible for coal, you know, being as dominant as it is, which of course is bullshit. Coal is dominant because it's cheap. I mean, India and China continue to build coal plants because it's really, really cheap and it's plentiful. That's why it's happening, not because of the anti-nuke movement. But aside from that, you know, when it comes to the climate change issue, there's a number of things that I think that they are blatantly misrepresenting and are ignoring. One is the cost, that it's so much more expensive to promote, you know, atomic energy than it is to go and promote renewables. Also the time frame for this stuff. I mean, if you believe the latest like IPCC reports, we've got to reduce by 2030 something like, I don't even know, what is it, 50% CO2 emission. We can't roll out nuke plants in time to meet those goals. It just isn't feasible. And then aside from that, it's not reliable. I mean, this is not a reliable energy source. I often look at France. You know, France, they sort of put up on the pedestal as the perfect atomic nation in the world, that it operates perfectly and everything's great there. Well, that's not true at all. Last summer, during the height of the European heat wave, half the plants in France were offline. And they were offline because of corrosion issues, but a lot of them were offline because the rivers that they draw water from to cool down the reactors were too warm, in some cases too low, to cool the reactors down. So you have climate change, which is evaporating the rivers and making them too warm to cool down the reactors in the first place. So it's not reliable. And then of course the risks, and then of course the waste. There's no answer for the waste. None of them have an answer for permanently storing this waste safely for millennia. I don't think a lot of people understand the dangers of plutonium, and which I've learned a lot about with, you know, researching Hanford. But this stuff sticks around. It's radioactive for 250,000 years. So really, to keep it safely stored, and if we had as many nuke plants as they want, thousands of them all over the world, we're going to have so much plutonium. You're going to have, this stuff's going to be around way, way, way after we're gone, right? And how are you going to keep that safe? How are you going to even, the ideas of putting it in tombs and storing it deep underground, what's that going to look like in 100,000 years, you know, let alone 250,000 years? And then on top of that, this stuff can be used in bombs. Once plutonium goes through the fission process, or uranium goes through the fission process, produces plutonium, you're already one step closer to being able to use that in an atomic warhead. So, you know, proliferation is a huge, huge issue. And for anybody on the left that doesn't see the connection between atomic energy and atomic bombs is completely ignorant or completely disingenuous. Financially, they're linked. They're linked in France, they're linked to the US, and they always will be. And then they're linked scientifically. I mean, you can't have one without the other. And the governments are always going to be in charge of this stuff because of the risks for proliferation. So you can't separate those two issues. And there's no other energy source that, you know, poses these kind of problems. And I challenge anybody that's proponent of this that also wants to, you know, de-escalate the threat of nuclear annihilation to, you know, address these issues. And I haven't seen anybody do it very well.
You know, what's striking is in the last few months, we've had all these train derailments, and you know, which kind of prove the government does nothing to inspect these things and doesn't have a solution to it. In Texas, where I spent a lot of time, people froze to death, you know, during a cold snap. Why is there this sense that somehow nuclear energy is going to be regulated or made safe by the same people who can't keep a railroad on the tracks?
Yeah, and this isn't to say, think about that waste when they're transporting it.
I think one of the derailments going to pick up, I believe, waste?
Yeah, one of them was, right. Yeah. And this actually going back to Hanford, back in the 80s, and some of the indigenous struggles there, Hanford at that time, along with Yucca, was being eyed as a repository for waste, high-level waste. And the Yakama Nation, led by Russell Jim, who I have a chapter about in the book, fought back against this. They said basically, like, Hanford is toxic enough. We don't need to be shoveling more radioactive waste into Hanford. And part of that was also they were fighting railroads and transportation routes through Yakama Nation to Hanford. And they knew back in the 80s, like, this stuff, you can't just put it on a truck and haul it around and think that it's, no risk of an accident. It's a huge issue. And they were successful, and they blocked Hanford from receiving more waste. And over that, during that fight, we also were, the public was given tens of thousands of documents that were previously secret documents. And we learned a lot about what had been going on at Hanford. But anyway, fast forwarding to the transportation of waste, I mean, that's another issue. And think if we had hundreds and hundreds of these plants that were all, even if they somehow approved Yucca Mountain, and you have all these railroads and all these routes going into Yucca, even if we believed that the storage would be safe, which it never would be, all that transportation poses its own risks. I mean, there are just so many problems around all the issues around this technology that it's like a no-brainer, I feel like, for those of us that are concerned about the future of the planet. I mean, if somehow it was even carbon neutral, which uranium mining is not carbon neutral, it's very carbon intensive. But let's say that it was, let's say that everything's carbon neutral, you still have all these other problems. And if the concern really is about the future health of the planet, how can you ignore the rest of this stuff? I just find it mind-boggling.
Talking about there's the amount of time that would take, like, we have these, timeline. It's timeline around, like, climate urgency, 2050, 2040, 2050, what have you. And so, a return to nuclear energy in the US would, is not going to be able to meet those timelines. But then also there's the cost. And, like, my understanding is the private sector or Wall Street doesn't actually have any interest in funding,
No.
a nuclear build out, a new nuclear build out. Doesn't seem like the government wants to do it. And then I'm not quite sure if international financial institutions like the World Bank want to make loans to do that anywhere. Probably not in the US. And so I'm kind of curious where they also think this is going to be funded from.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they always point to the funding that's going into renewables and that there's subsidies for that and tax breaks. I mean, they look at the Biden's last big bill, the Reduction Act, that whatever it is, 480 billion to renewables. But tucked into that is also the ability to keep existing nuke plants open. Yeah, I don't know what their answer is for that. Ultimately, I think that they don't care about the price tag, and I think that they think that this is worth every penny that's poured into it, and they don't see it taking away from existing renewables. They see it as complementing that, which of course it's not. It's totally taking away from other things that we could be doing. But I think it's also having this discussion about one versus the other, at least on the left and from an environmental perspective. In my view, also it takes away from some of the bigger, probably even more challenging conversations that we need to be having about our lifestyle and our society in general and our consumptive nature, and how we should be thinking about restructuring our cities, restructuring our transportation, the way we grow food, how we travel. All of these things need to be part of the conversation, and not just how do we switch from coal to nuclear or natural gas to solar. I mean, I think that there's a bigger conversation that needs to go on, and I think it's our duty on the left and as environmentalists to talk about this. And I don't think that they want to address that. I mean, a lot of these so-called leftists that are pro-nuke have no problem with, they are pro-growth. they're pro-consumption. They're not that different ultimately than the capitalist class. And I think that needs to be challenged as well.
Pro air conditioning and all this other kind of stuff.
Right.
I guess that's one thing that's been striking, because I've talked to kind of like MSNBC liberals who are pro-nuke, but also plenty of people I know who are like DSA folks who have kind of jumped on the bandwagon, and as you pointed out, invoke France as kind of the template for what the U.S. could do. And you've just talked about safety, but aren't there like health concerns as well? Like I think you mentioned some of these that were cancer rates spiked, and groundwater's polluted, toxic.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you'd even just follow some of the regulatory agencies and the watchdogs and the things that are happening, I mean, every day there's another issue with some of these plants. I mean, the existing plants in the US in particular are old, and they constantly need to be fixed. There's also there's problems. A lot of, look at even here in where Scott and I are in California, Gavin Newsom is kept open Diablo Canyon. But meanwhile, Diablo is a huge, huge risk, right? I mean, it's on a fault line. It's way past its lifespan. It's sits right on the ocean. There's so many problems, and in and around that area, even at San Onofre down closer to where I am at, the waste that's there, it's just sitting there. I mean, so you have these big old tanks that are holding this waste in dry casks many, many times near water sources. If the electricity goes down somehow, if there's an earthquake, the people in and around that area are going to be immediately impacted. And that's the same case with Diablo. San Luis Obispo folks up around that area are going to be immediately impacted. Up in Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest, the Trojan plant that was shut down about 20 years ago, that the waste from that plant is still sitting there in these dry casks. Well, there's a big plan to roll out these small modular reactors up and down the Columbia River downstream from Hanford. It's just bonkers stuff. But each one of those facilities would also produce waste, and that waste would then go over and be stored where the waste from Trojan is stored. And this is really close to the mouth of the Columbia River. And this stuff, geologically speaking, is going to last a really, really long time. Well, we know that that sits in a subduction zone. There's going to be a huge, huge earthquake there at some point. It could be tomorrow. It could be in 10,000 years or 100,000 years, but it's gonna happen eventually. And that radioactive material in those tanks is going to just be gone. So aside from being, if you live near a plant and there's higher rates of thyroid cancers and things like that, there's also this other problem with this waste and the radiation that's in and around it, and the inability to keep it safe forever. It's an impossibility, and there's no answer for it.
The other thing we've talked on this some already, but just the sort of the extraction side, a lot of these folks, I mean, I follow left media and left podcasts, and there's a lot of stuff they talk about I agree with, and when it comes to extraction around fossil fuels and Standing Rock or Line 3, they were all in. They were very supportive of that, and it's amazing to me when we get into like new uranium extraction, then all of a sudden becomes it's jobs for indigenous people, and it's like it's safe. And I find that really troubling, how easy it is to sort of like just flip that switch. I think that one particular pro-nuke propagandist, Lee Phillips, was actually talking about how First Nations people in Ontario who were working in uranium mines, the tribal government or whatever supported it and voted for it. It was jobs, and it was all safe, and they were happy about it. Which to me is like that's the tribal governments are often like very much aligned with like the actual government, and just like which is run by corporate lobbyists in many ways. It's just it's amazing to me that this sort of issue, particularly around exploitation of indigenous folks and even just workers in general, is like sort of they turn a blind eye to it.
Yeah, and they also ignore the history of it. The Navajo, the Dene here in the U.S. and the Southwest. I mean, it's so well documented, the impacts that uranium mining had on indigenous laborers for decades. The high rates, the lung diseases, the heart attacks, that were greater than the population that didn't work in the mines that smoked cigarettes. I mean, there's so much epidemiological evidence of how horrific this mining, incidents were. And then of course there's the accidents that happened in the mines. It was a brutal enterprise, and they ignore that nuclear colonialism aspect of atomic energy and atomic production in general. And that's really, really troubling. And of course, if they were to have their way, all of these indigenous lands would be completely exploited for uranium mining. And that in and of itself should be a non-starter for all of us, right? But for them, it's like game on. And they mask it as creating jobs. Well, does that mean that we should completely support all extractive industries because it creates jobs? No, obviously, but in their minds, I guess, they're propagandists. And I think that the best way to counter that is to tell the stories and tell this history, especially among like the younger, like DSA type folks, because I don't think a lot of these kids, and the ones I've talked to that are in their 20s and don't know about this stuff because it's never been taught to them and never read about it. And of course, Lee Phillips and the rest of the Jacobin crowd isn't going to write much about this or talk about it or interview those on the ground that are impacted by it, or talk to those who've had relatives die of thyroid cancers. And they're not going to like really address this stuff. So I think it's our job to put this information out there, and I'm glad you're all doing it, because it's unfortunately now the battles that are still being fought. I think that we thought we won a lot of these battles, but they're being resurrected again, all in the name of fighting climate change, and it's really disheartening to see.
Yeah, about what percentage of Americans, if you know, have access to some kind of energy plan with solar or wind power available to them?
You mean just like on a local municipality?
Yeah, like just a rough ballpark, like how widespread is this, the availability of it? Because we hear a lot of like kind of public relations about this shift to renewables, and you see corporations with commercials, all the time talking about how green they are, and the whole green idea has been commodified. But like, how many Americans actually could do that, could choose that?
A lot. It gets really muddy because of how we define renewables. Aside taking all the atomic energy aspect out of it, which sometimes gets lumped in renewables and sometimes it doesn't. But things like dams, right? I mean, dams are, believe it or not, the #1 renewable energy in the world, as far as power generation goes. But as Scott will talk about, I mean, dams are not renewable in the sense that they usually require huge, logging to happen. They require a complete reconfiguration of rivers. In the case of the huge Three Gorges Dam in China, that displaced millions of people, they've had horrific flooding. They had to cut down native redwood forests. I mean, but it's considered renewable. So I don't know. So when we talk about like renewable in that sense, I think it's difficult. So I guess to answer your question, it's a difficult question to answer because of how we define renewables. Now, as far as it gets to like, local subsidies and things for like solar panels, in places like California, which was a long time a leader in solar installations on rooftops, Newsom in the electric lobby here has pushed against that, because ultimately putting solar on your roof is fighting against the dominant grid. And so when these SoCal Edison and the rest of them and PG&E lose their power, essentially, that they don't control the grid, that's a big threat to their profit margins. And they don't want us having solar on our rooftops. And they've made it harder to do so in the state. It's happened in Arizona, it's happened elsewhere. So there's been a real pushback against rooftop solar in particular, which has really been a horrible thing, because PG&E and others would rather see investments going into huge solar plantations out in the Mojave Desert, eating up public lands and destroying, habitat for tortoises and all kinds of plants and Joshua trees and everything else. But that doesn't change the structure of how their profit margins are inflated, because they still then will control the flow of energy. They don't want us producing energy. So, getting into this conversation about decentralizing the grid is another one that even the pro-nuke folks don't want to have, but it's central to the future if we're going to fight climate change.
Someone I know in Arizona has solar, and the state imposes a fairly hefty user fee every month on them, just because.
Yeah. I mean, we have solar on our house. I don't have a battery or anything, but it's we're sort of now going to be grandfathered in with our power during the day. When we produce more than we use, goes back onto the grid, and traditionally we would get credits for that, paid for that by the power company. And then at the end of the cycle, essentially, we at night, when we're pulling off the grid, we usually zero out. We've usually produced enough during the day that compensate for what we use at night. But that's going to be harder to do now for new construction or people that are putting solar on their homes. Here, they're not going to get those same rates, which is a disincentive to put solar on your roof in the first place, which is the whole point of what why they're going after this. And they've mimicked the legislation in California after the legislation in Arizona, and used those same tactics to push back against rooftop solar. So, so Gavin Newsom is keeping Diablo open and making it harder to put solar on your roof. You can see where, who's putting butter on his bread.
But we also, I mean, with Gavin, we can also talk about how he's, talks a big game on, not approving permits for fracking and oil extraction in different parts of the state and offshore, and yet still takes a lot of money from the Western States Petroleum Association, and even though it's liberal green California, it's still sort of run by the oil and gas lobby in Sacramento in many ways.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Kind of one final thing. This is just brief. If you're talking to someone who would consider him or herself a socialist or a leftist, and who's just heard Lee Phillips or somebody, go on this ad campaign for nuclear power, how would you kind of briefly tell them, that they're wrong? What would you briefly say to them to make an argument? And kind of part of this is for me, because I'm seeing this a lot lately, where people who I trust and respect on this issue, really kind of gone over.
Yeah, well, they probably have watched the Oliver Stone documentary or something.
he's a green and red favorite, so.
Yeah,
we still have that challenge. If anybody knows Oliver Stone, a crisp new $100 bill, if it comes on green and red, and he doesn't have to deduct it, doesn't have to declare it. It's cash, so nobody will know the better. Yeah.
Well, I would say that there's two things going on. There's one of the sort of the hypotheticals of atomic energy, which I think a lot of the people that support it are on that side of things, about in this hypothetical camp. And then there's the realistic camp, which I think is the one that we all should be in, which is understanding the history of atomic energy, of the risks that it poses, and also the reality that it is connected to nuclear weapons. So if you're worried about proliferation, you have to also oppose atomic energy. And I use the analogy of you can't oppose the war on terror, but support Pentagon spending, right? That's not how it works in the real world. And that's very much the same thing when we were talking about energy versus weapons. In France, the biggest, holder of the biggest nuclear arsenal in Europe, and the United States, the biggest one in the world. Both the industries are deeply connected. There's a reason why that is, of course, because the stuff that goes into making these weapons, making these reactors, and the waste that they produce, they're all connected to the weapons industry. The same contractors are building the same reactors for plutonium grade. We don't have to produce any more plutonium in this country because we made so much of it at Hanford. But there's, that's why it's controlled by those same industries. So if you're worried about proliferation, you should also be worried, about how atomic energy feeds into that. and the potential for this getting into the wrong hands, right? They would like to see these plants all over the world. Well, those who can say that, you know, what's going to be like in 100 years if there's all this plutonium sitting around and who gets their hands on it? I mean, that to me is a real danger. That's the first thing I would say to someone on the left. The second thing I would say is there's no answer for this waste. How can you ever support an industry that's going to produce something that's dangerous for 250,000 years that we don't have an answer for? We don't have a permanent repository for this stuff now in this country. And most of the waste that these plants produce is still sitting there on site where all these plants exist. So you don't have an answer for what to even do with this waste. And that's a huge problem. And the risks are really, really great. And so I think those are the two things that I like to, at least bring up as issues. And then of course, the other one is uranium mining, because they often come at us with, this is a carbon neutral energy source. Well, then how can you justify, first of all, it's not, when you look at the whole life cycle of a nuclear plant and how much fossil fuels are burned in construction of these facilities, let alone what's going on with the mining operations. I mean, the denser the uranium ore is, the more carbon is needed to extract the uranium from that ore. It's a very, very carbon intensive process. And you can't deny that, and there's no getting around that. So, I think that's another issue that some at least might be receptive to, because they're greatly concerned about climate change. So those are the three things I would talk about. And then of course, just the reality that, yeah, hypothetically, we could get this all done really quickly if we had all this money, we only focused on atomic energy. But in reality, the reality is, this is never going to happen in time. Even if we were to believe all the propaganda, it's never going to happen in time to make a difference when it comes to the climate. And that's another big one as well.
Yeah, I've been telling people to watch The Simpsons and ask if they want Homer as their safety inspector. So.
He might be better than some of them out there if they were allowed to do this. Yeah, and then lastly, I don't want to downplay the risks of these plants in war zones. Of course, Ukraine is the prime example, right? But Taiwan, they have nuke plants, and that may be a battleground between China and the U.S. in the coming years. And who's to say that those plants aren't going to be used as tools of war? And we have plants in the Middle East. I mean, all of these plants pose, insurmountable, just risks beyond any kind of comprehension, because they've never been used like this before. They've never been in a war zone, an active plant in a war zone like this. So if we had thousands of these plants all over the place, and how that could even be monitored and controlled is, it's impossible. So that's another thing that I would bring up when talking about them. I mean, even the worst of the fossil fuels doesn't pose the same risks in a war zone. And no one would argue otherwise.
The other thing I like to talk about too is, and because I'm a bit of a movement historian and an organizer, is actually I feel like some of the best organizing that happened in the U.S. in the last half century, the last 40 or 50 years, was the anti-nuke movement. And I think about, a lot of as an organizer in the anti-fossil fuel movement, whether it's extraction or against plants or other infrastructure, was like very much modeled on like what we saw at Seabrook, New Hampshire in the 70s, Diablo Canyon, Rocky Mountain Flats, places like that. And a lot of my mentors were people I was a little too young to be part of the anti-nuclear movement, but a lot of my mentors were those organizers who took big risks. Some of the first SLAP suits, strategic litigation against public participation, civil suits were against anti-nuke activists at Diablo Canyon. So it was a powerful movement, and the sort of disingenuous way in which some of the pro-nuke left people in particular, I expect it from the industry, but the way in which they sort of attack and just disregard that powerful moment in movement history is very troubling.
Yeah. I mean, I've long thought that it's our duty on the left to build on the successes of the past, not tear them down, right? And that's exactly what they're doing. But maybe it is because that those movements were so successful that they're so threatened by them even to this day, right? That those of us that don't buy into it are going to continue that legacy, and that's a big threat to them. And I think that's great. I think they should be afraid because, we're not going anywhere.
Josh, it's been great talking to you. Folks, you've been listening to Joshua Frank, author of Atomic Days, The Untold Story of the Most Toxic Place in America, managing editor at CounterPunch, investigative journalist. You can check out many of his writings at counterpunch.org. You can also buy the book if you haven't already bought the book. We even have a few free copies at the Green Red Podcast. You can always message us for them as well. Josh, it's been great talking to you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been awesome. Sorry, I get a little fired up.
Yeah, it's all good. Yeah, we're pro fired up here. We're anti-nuke, but pro fired up.
Great.
Folks, if you like what you're hearing, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you want to make a donation, go to greenredpodcast.org and hit support, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And as always, go out and make trouble and misbehave. Talk to y'all soon.
It stands out on the highway like a creature from another time. It inspires the babies' questions. They say, "What's that?" They ask their mothers as they ride. Yeah, but no one stopped to think about the babies or how they would survive. And we've almost lost Detroit this time. How would we ever get